Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Sunriver U's presentation of the history of Sunriver, presented by Sunriver resident, advocate, and generally amazing human being, John Salzer. My name is Nathan Moses, and any of you that catch any of our OSU Cascades virtual events might know of me, but just in case you don't, I'm the Assistant Director of University Events and Community Engagement for the Ben Beeves. I am very excited to kick off this first event as an example of the collaborative efforts that the university and community can produce, and hopefully demonstrates our commitment to service as part of our mission in serving Central Oregon. Grassroots digital community programming like this series are what bring a new level of vibrancy and connection to all of us. And for that, I'm very appreciative of the Sunriver U crew making this happen tonight. Before we get started with the event, we have a few upcoming events that we'd like you to be made aware of. First up is we have a number of events coming on. The first one is a town hall and forum with the SROA board. This is the first of a regular series of town halls presented by the SROA board, the Owner Enrichment Committee, and Sunriver U. Each town hall will address current topics in Sunriver, and this one will address the North Pole, Mary McCallum Park, Fort Rock Park, and the Pathway Tunnels. Again, this is going to happen on March 15th at 4 p.m. The history of Sunriver 2, if you're joining us tonight, hopefully you're going to join us for the next two as well. We're going to have both the history of Sunriver 2 and 3 in this exact same format. So if you've signed up for one, hopefully you've signed up for the other two. They will be on March 25th and April 8th at the same time, 6 p.m. So hope to have you there. One thing as a reminder, you can find information about all the different classes and events that Sunriver U is putting on by going to www.sunriveru.com. Again, that's SUNRIVERYOU.com. You can see it on the screen right there. So thank you for that, and check those out. Okay, next up, for audience participation, those of you joining us from Sunriver tonight that may not have seen one of our virtual events, we use an application called Mentimeter. And down there at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see an event code, and you can actually download the menti.com app through your respective app store, or just open up a browser and go to mentimeter.com. Tonight's event code that you can see at the bottom is 45484629. And what that's going to do is you're going to basically log in there, and that's how we're going to ask John questions tonight after his presentation. So we'll shoot a few reminders in the YouTube chat if you have that, and then do a reminder here again after John's presentation how you can engage. So be thinking of those questions as he's going through what I think is an amazing historical look at one of the greatest parts of living in Central Oregon. So we'll get right to that, and I'd like to introduce John right now. So John is a 1966 graduate of Oregon State University, and later attended Stanford when he received his MBA before working in the telecommunications industry for 35 years. John first visited Sunriver in 1968 and vacationed there annually until he and his wife retired in 1999 and moved there permanently. In 2001, John helped establish the OSU Cascades Foundation and served as its chairperson for 6 years. In addition, he was on the selection committee that brought current Vice President Becky Johnson to Bend, so we definitely thank him for that. He's also been active in various nonprofits, including serving as Sunriver's United Way chair, campaign chair for 19 years, helping to spearhead Sunriver's Shark Project, and establishing the Sunriver Service District to provide service to the police and fire departments. He and his wife, Linda, attended as many Beavers women's basketball games as possible. He's a big fan. He's got season tickets to all the basketball games, and he's traveled even to Omaha to watch the team win 2 national championships. So without further ado, I would like to welcome John Salzer.
And I thank you, Nathan, for the nice introduction. This project has been a wonderful journey for me. Thank you for joining me today in the first of a series of presentations dealing with the history of Sunriver. Our present thought is that I will present 3 programs dealing with our community's history. Because our community is 51 years old, we thought dividing up the programs into 3 17-year segments would be nice. So that was our initial plan. But a little over a year ago, I made a presentation on the history of Sunriver at Shark. Some of you may have attended that. This was one of the last events at Shark before the pandemic hit. So as you have heard, Sunriver has partnered with OSU Cascades to enable us to have additional presentations utilizing Zoom technology and YouTube. And for an older person like me, this is a test, so bear with me. So why are we having additional presentations? Well, in my earlier presentation, I had to eliminate or brush over a lot of our history. So these new classes will give you a much clearer and more detailed understanding of our history. I should state up front that this is my interpretation of our history, and whenever possible, I have attempted to verify all of my information. But on occasion, I will add my personal opinion. So quote me at your own risk. Next slide. Today's program will focus on the early years, but we can't merely begin when construction began in 1967, because so much of our history was influenced by events that occurred long before 1967. So we'll start with some ancient history and go as far as we can today, and then pick up where we leave off in our next program in 2 weeks. I believe it is important that we focus on, I think it's important to focus on the founding fathers and what the founding mothers and fathers intended for our community, because their guiding principles are what made Sunriver the unique place it is today, and helps explain what we, the current owners and guests, need to do in order to keep it unique for our children and grandchildren. Therefore, today's program is very important. So next slide. So we'll start today's program focusing on the early years leading up to the official opening that occurred in January of 1969. Next slide. My history, what is that? Next slide. My history with Sunriver. In 1969, my wife and I were living in Portland, and I saw this full page ad in the newspaper, the Oregonian. I have the original ad right here. And at the bottom of the page, there was a coupon that you could fill in and send into Sunriver, and it offered you a free weekend. Linda and I ended up having a conflict that week. Linda had a conflict that week, so I decided to come by myself. After all, I said to myself, what could I lose? Next slide. So I still remember going through Bend on the way over to Sunriver, my first time over here. I had to wait 30 minutes on 3rd Avenue, the only road through Bend for a freight train like this one to pass. Kind of questioned myself, what was I getting into? Then I headed south, 15 miles up over Lava Butte on a 2-lane road that they called a highway. All of a sudden, out in the middle of nowhere was a sign saying Sunriver exit. As I turned onto South Century Drive, I wondered just what I'd gotten myself into, just for a free weekend. When I arrived, I was greeted by this big sign shown in this picture. In addition, I went to the lodge, and there were some gentlemen there who welcomed us. They were wearing a sweater like the one right here, which I have acquired, and it's had a Sunriver logo on it. And they gave me my room key to go to the room where the accommodations were. They were the lodge condos. Next slide. The accommodations were wonderful, if you remember back in 1968. As you can see, I was given rooms like this one in the newly built lodge condos. Next slide. Notice the beautiful shag carpet, orange, red, and black. Those of you who are older like me can remember that, and you can't find anything like that today. Next slide. There were several dozen of us for the weekend. We were fed very well, and all we were required to do was to board a bus and take a tour of the property, and then sit through an hour presentation. At the end of the presentation, we were informed that all of us could purchase a lot that we saw on our tour, any lot, for that was normally priced at $7,000, we could buy one that weekend for only $6,000. I failed to do it. Next slide. I left Sunday afternoon really impressed with what Sunriver founders were trying to accomplish, but had absolutely no confidence they could pull it off. So fast forward 30 years, and I realized they had pulled it off. Linda and I purchased a home and moved here to retire in 1999. So when I was given the opportunity to give this class on Sunriver's history, I jumped at the opportunity because I really wanted to find out for myself exactly how did the founders pull it off. That's the reason I'm doing this. Next slide. So what began as a fairly simple assignment has turned into a full-time passion. Because a picture is worth 1,000 words, this presentation will have a lot of pictures. So let's start at the beginning, and I mean the beginning. About 7,000 years ago, a volcano created what is now known as Lava Butte. Next slide. It created a circular cone at the top. Next slide. And here is what it looks like today. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. The eruption also created a 15-mile long lake called Lake Benham. The orange circle on the right shows Sunriver. Between 6,000 and 3,000 years ago, climate changes turned the region from an arid landscape to lush wetlands surrounded by thick forests. Then additional changes over the past 3,000 years resulted in the disappearance of Lake Benham and the formation of the Deschutes River. Next slide. Of course, the first inhabitants of the area were Native Americans who camped in caves and along the Deschutes River and in the Great Meadow. Evidence exists that they were here long before Lava Butte erupted 7,000 years ago. Next slide. Early in the 20th century, the first explorers arrived. Peter Skine Ogden was believed to be one of the very first white persons to set ground in the Sunriver area in 1825, when he led an expedition through the area on his way to California. Next slide. Early in the winter of 1843, Captain John C. Fremont traveled through the area on a mapping expedition on his way, also on his way to California. Fremont would become famous. Anybody know why? He was the Republican Party's first candidate for president in 1856. So raise your hand if you already knew this. I see a few hands. I assume you learned this in your American history class, right? Okay, for those of you whose hands are raised, who can tell me who defeated him in the presidential election? Anybody? The answer was James Buchanan. Two of the guides who led Fremont's expedition were Kit Carson, who most of us know from our history classes, and also, next slide, Billy Chinook, a young Native American by the name of Billy Chinook. Chinook, who was 19 years old at the time, went back to Washington, D.C. with Fremont, where he was educated, and then came back to Oregon, where he would become chief of the Warm Springs tribe. Next slide. Shortly thereafter, Lieutenant Henry Larcom Abbott led an Army expedition sponsored by the Pacific Railroad through the area. They camped in the Great Meadow on September 2nd, 1843. Interestingly enough, that exhibition had 126 people. So it was a pretty big party. Shortly thereafter, settlers came to homestead in the area, with many others to follow. The reason I bring up Abbott's name was that in 1942, the Army named Camp Abbott after him. Next slide. So I'm going to go through there are three major events that impacted the development of Sunriver. The first was logging. Two companies, Shevlin-Hixon and Brooks Scanlon, many of you are familiar with those names, were both Minnesota companies that had devastated the forests of Minnesota. They were so successful in this effort that the forests of Minnesota were gone. So they had to do something, so they decided to head west to find trees. They came to Oregon. Between 1890 and 1910, the two companies bought up almost 300,000 acres of forest from the newly formed U.S. Forest Service. At the time, Sunriver was a huge ponderosa forest, trees as big as 6 to 8 feet in diameter, like the one shown here, were plentiful in and around Sunriver and were easy pickings. Next slide. Notice, if you will, the two loggers are using axes to cut down this giant ponderosa. Wonder how long that took. Next slide. Once the trees were down, they had to get them to the Deschutes River. They did this, next slide, by hauling them out using huge pack horses like this one, next slide, from the woods to the Deschutes River. Next slide. Once in the river, they floated down the river to the two mills in Bend. Next slide. Here, the logs were staged for moving into the two mills. The Shevlin-Hixon mill on your left opened in March of 1912, and the Brooks Scanlon mill on the right opened a month later. I've always wondered how they knew which log went left and which log went right. Next slide. 5 years later, the Shevlin-Hixon mill produced 103 million board feet of lumber, while Brooks Scanlon cut 65 million board feet. In 1922, Brooks Scanlon opened this new and larger mill. The area where the mill was now makes up the largest portion of today's Old Mill District that we're familiar with. Next slide. Next slide. No, I'm going to go back. One more. That's it. 5 years later, oh, I got that. Okay, then go next slide. Yeah. Five years later, the Shevlin, oh no, okay, I'm lost my place. Here we are. Okay, go one next one. Yeah. Bend at the time was a boom town. The two mills employed over 2,000 employees working around the clock. They were the two largest mills in the US by 1924. They were producing 300 board feet of lumber a day. So how much is 300,000 board feet? Care to take a guess? The answer, enough wood to frame 30 houses every day. By December 1950, the last available tree had been harvested as the two companies had depleted their timber lands. Not one seedling had been planted. I find this fact amazing and astounding. Anyway, Shevlin-Hixon sold its interest to Brooks Scanlon. Brooks Scanlon eventually closed its operation in 1983 and was in a state of near ruin before being restored in 1990s by Bill Miller, who created the old mill district. The smokestacks, next slide, the smokestacks in the old mill are all that remain. Brooks Scanlon eventually decided to go into the development business at about the same time that John Gray did. Here's one of my editorial comments. Does anyone besides me find it ironic that the new Brooks Scanlon Development Company ended up buying and developing Black Butte Ranch? Ironically, Black Butte Ranch is one of the few areas which still had beautiful old growth ponderosa. Think about it. Next slide. Here is what Sunriver looked like after the two companies had finished their cutting operation in and around Sunriver. Evidently, it never dawned on the two lumber giants that they might want to replant trees where they had been cutting every tree in sight. Next slide. And how did the logging impact Sunriver? Well, here is what Sunriver looked like in 1968, almost 20 years later. We just completed building the lodge in the lower right-hand corner. Next slide. The second major activity that impacted the development of Sunriver was Camp Abbott. Most of us are familiar with this. During the first few years of the war, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers were trained at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. The Corps realized they needed to rapidly expand its combat engineering training. The Corps checked it out and determined that the high desert was ideal for training and planning European strategies, with the Deschutes River filling in for the Rhine River in France and the surrounding mountains providing clear, cold weather for long foot marches and operation of airports. So in 1942, in October, approval was given to start building Camp Abbott. Here, soldiers are embarking on their first project. Next slide. Erecting the entrance to the camp from Highway 97. The construction of Camp Abbott began in December of 1942 with a 500-person crew. Amazingly, a hard delivery date of May 1st, 6 months, was established to complete the camp, and yet they were move-in ready in 4 short months. Next slide. The camp was designed to be a self-contained city, complete with 50 barracks, mess halls, a 471-bed hospital, recreation facilities, laundry facilities, electricity, water and sewer systems, roads, and whatever else was necessary to accommodate 10,000 people. It's amazing. They created a city, in essence, of 10,000 people in 5 months. Here is an early drawing of what the camp would look like. Next slide. The first contingent of 250 soldiers to be trained arrived on May 1st, 1943. Shortly thereafter, the population of Camp Abbott was 10,000 soldiers, with 900 new trainees arriving every 2 weeks. In total, 900,000 troops were trained here at Camp Abbott. Next slide. This is hard to see, but this is a map. I'll go back 1 or 2. I'll go forward, go forward. 1 more. 2 more, go forward 2 more. That's it right there. This is hard to see, but this is a map showing Camp Abbott in orange and Sunriver in black. What I wanted to show was that the overlapping area. But just like you do today, you came in over the railroad bridge, the main entrance to Sunriver, to get to Camp Abbott. The 411 bed hospital complex stretched from where the current Sunriver Business Park is located all the way to Parkland and East Park lanes inside the Sunriver proper. Next slide. On what is now the 10th tee of the Meadows course is where soldiers learn how to dodge bullets in an obstacle course. The head of the camp was a Colonel Frank Besson, who I'll talk about in a minute. He was the head man, and he opened the firing range with the first shot, a bullseye. Next slide. The picture on the left is a view of what is now the airport, looking to River Road, where the rifle and machine gun ranges were located. The picture on the right is practicing in the trenches. Looks like fun. During the first 6 weeks of training, soldiers were trained in combat skills such as hand-to-hand combat, defensive tactics, and marksmanships. They were also taught map reading and compass reading and first aid. Next slide. The second 8-week stage separated trainees into groups and were trained in such skills as sawmill operation, automobile maintenance, heavy equipment operation, and administration. Next slide. During the last 3-week phase of training, the soldiers lived in the field under simulated battle conditions. They slept outside in foxholes, ate sea rations, carried heavy packs everywhere, from Lakeview to Prineville to Burns to Camp Abbott. After turning raw recruits into soldiers, they now received specialized training. One specialty was how to quickly build all kinds of bridges over streams and rivers. Many bridges were built over the Deschutes River here in Sunriver. Others were trained in demolition, that is, how to blow up bridges. So as soon as bridges were built by one group of soldiers one day, they were blown up by another group the following day. Next slide. The biggest contribution, the one we're most familiar with, that Camp Abbott gave us, was what is now known as the Great Hall. It started on October 1st in 1943, and it took 6 months to build and was considered a training exercise for the 500 soldiers dedicated to building it. Next slide. It was by far the largest single project at Camp Abbott, a building 50 feet wide and 96 feet long. It was going to be the Officers Club. Next slide. So how many training hours went into this exercise? As you can see, a lot. Let me just go through in some detail. A total of 21,000 hours were spent by carpenters. Next slide. This tree was actually the one used for creating the large beams at each end of the current balcony in the Great Hall. Next slide. They were cut to size using a really big saw. Next slide. A lot of the work was done by hand. Next slide. Over 500 pine, next slide. Over 500 pine trees were cut down in snow and freezing weather. Next slide. The 40-foot beams, as well as the 511 logs and slabs, were all located on and cut on site. Next slide. But heavy equipment also played a role in the building of the building. Next slide. As you can see, the entire frame for the building was built out of lumber. Next slide. Here, carpenters are seen installing the spiral staircase. They did it by hand, a key feature of the facility today. Next slide. Here is a worker installing the spiral staircase. Again, all done by hand. Next slide. Here is the railing being installed like it is today. Next slide. Besides the carpenters, there were 33,200 manual hours were spent constructing the building. Next slide. Here they are. You can see them doing some of the constructing of the building. Next slide. Here's another picture. A total of 150,000 board feet of lumber were put into the building. Next slide. Electricians spent 1,200 hours wiring the building. Next slide. 1,800 hours were spent painting the building. And a total of 5,800 manual hours were spent collecting the rocks, then constructing the fireplaces in the building. Here's a picture, next slide. Picture of the two fireplaces look like this, and a total of 10 tons of volcanic rock was used to construct these. Next slide. All of the rock was collected and shaped from stone they found in the Deschutes and Willamette forests. Next slide. So in total, as you can see, in 6 months, they spent a total of 63,000 manual hours building what is now the Great Hall. It was the officers' building at that time. Amazing, to me anyway, was the fact that the only out-of-pocket cost to build the structure was $4,796, down to the dollar, $4,796. And this was for materials unavailable locally, such as window panes, cement, and plumbing fixtures. Here is what the inside of the building looked like. Next slide. They literally put up the roof, the final part of the roof, on December 24th, just in time for, next picture, the officers' Christmas party. This was the first and only event ever held in the building. So they spent 63,000 hours building this building in order to have a Christmas party. Next slide. The Christmas party was dedicated to Colonel Besson, the camp leader. Next slide. The Great Hall was actually formally dedicated on April 29th, 1944. Just 1 month later came unexpected orders from Washington, D.C. Unconfirmed rumors indicated that it was going to be turned into an Italian POW camp. That didn't turn out to be the case. Orders came that the camp was to be closed down and was to be gone within 6 months. The roads, building, foundations, sewer system, and other utilities remained, as did the Great Hall. Does anyone know why the Great Hall wasn't destroyed when the camp closed? It survived, according to John Gray, only because, in typical Army fashion, it was never formally approved in the first place. It was a training exercise. So it didn't show up on the official order of buildings needing to be destroyed when liquidating the camp. So much of the buildings were torn down and the material was moved to a staging area where the Shark parking lot is located on Beaver Drive. It isn't a coincidence that this is now a parking lot, which you'll understand in more detail why this is the case when we talk about Shark in a later program. Next slide. A little known fact is that three other structures besides the Great Hall actually did survive the war. Camp Abbott Chapel, pictured here, was disassembled piece by piece and later reconstructed in Prineville, and now exists as Our Savior Lutheran Church on 3rd Avenue in Prineville. Next slide. The camp barracks were disassembled and moved to Summer Lake, located on Highway 31, halfway between Sunriver and Lakeview, and was turned into the lodge at Summer Lake, where it is still operational. Bet most of you didn't know that. Next slide. On the left, you are looking down from the living room past the original restrooms towards the center of the old barracks of the Great Hall, of Camp Abbott, with rooms added to either side. The picture on the right shows the living room. Notice the original pine boards that came from the Great Hall. Next page. Finally, also surviving was one of the 3 sewer treatment plants that exists next to the Public Works building here in Sunriver and is used today for storage, and is called the Roundhouse. Why it was kept up, nobody knows. Here's the next picture. So what happened after Camp Abbott left? For several years, it was used by the Bend Elks for their meetings and also as part of their baseball team operation. It went into disrepair until 1953, when a couple from Bend, Wade and Dorothy Collins, bought the building and the property and paid $29,000 for it. And they had the intention of converting it into a restaurant and nightclub, which is what they did. They fixed it up and 2 years later opened it and had it operational for 2 years, but soon discovered that people in Bend didn't have any desire or the money to travel 15 miles all the way to their restaurant and tavern to entertain themselves. So what did they do? They end up selling it. I'll tell you in a minute. Next page. So how was the Great Hall restored to its present state? That comes later, but I'll let you know how the leaky roof was repaired. Next slide. In the 70s, Sunriver became the place to go to film Western movies. The first movie filmed here in Sunriver was called The Way West, starring Kirk Douglas, Robert Mitchum, and Richard Widmark. And also a little known actress, she didn't even get the credits on the cover, by the name of Sally Fields. In exchange for not paying to use Sunriver for the 6 weeks of filming, the film's construction crew put a new roof on the Great Hall. So that's how the roof got fixed. Next slide. So for those of you who have never seen the Great Hall, here is what it looks like today. We'll talk about how it got that way later in the program. Next slide. So I talked about the first two major influences were logging and Camp Abbott. The third major influence that impacted the development of Sunriver was Lee Evans. Now, who in the heck is Lee Evans? Let me tell you. In 1964, the Hudspeth family had bought the property from the couple that owned it for the restaurant and nightclub, and used the property. They used it for a cattle ranch. They even stored cattle inside the Great Hall, and they also stored hay there. But in 1964, the Hudspeth family defaulted on a loan secured by their Camp Abbott property. They turned to Lee Evans, shown here, a California businessman who had married a Hudspeth, to help sell the property. Lee had experience with development, having developed a multi-story office building in Oklahoma City, as well as a shopping center in Santa Rosa, California. Lee, while not a forgotten person in our history, could very well have been the most important person. Why is this? Well, instead of selling the property, Lee and his wife opted to buy it. Next slide. Lee and his wife then hired consultants. The first consultant investigated the idea of turning the property into a high-tech industrial park, and Lee didn't like that idea. So they then hired a California planner by the name of Guillermo Lehman to create a plan for developing the property. This is what the property was going to look like in 5 years. Behind me is a blown up, the actual map that I discovered in the storage room at the resort. So this is the original plan, and it called for 5-acre lots and a golf course. Next slide. Lehman also called for diverting the Deschutes River, which is shown here in black, through the Great Meadow to maximize waterfront building sites. So the blue that I've highlighted was actually a canal he was going to build. And the idea was this would allow homeowners direct access to the river. It was originally going to be called Evans Park after Lee Evans, and then changed to Castorellis, named after a resort in the French Riviera of France. In other words, instead of being called Sunriver, it's going to be called Castorellis, and we were going to be the Venice of the West. So what happened? Next page. Then Don McCallum enters the picture. Evans didn't have the money to do the development. So he reached out to McCallum, who was the owner of a Portland real estate title company, to try to convince him to become an investor in his project. McCallum had hunted and fished the area and was appalled by Evans's plan. He then brought in John Gray, who had just finished developing Salishan on the Oregon coast, to meet with Evans. Gray and his family had also spent time in Central Oregon skiing and hunting. He too was shocked and repelled with Evans's plan. So McCallum met with Evans and convinced him to bring John Gray and himself in as equal partners, and the three of them formed Abbott Recreational Lands, later named Sunriver Property, and the rest is history. Evans stayed on as 1/3 partner until 1968, when he sold his interest to Gray and McCallum and moved back to California. So that's why he is not a well-known character. Next page. One of the truly unrecognized person in Sunriver's early history is Don's wife, Mary McCallum. We'll hear more about her later. Next slide. Just the next slide is picture of John Gray, who was president of Omark Industry and also the developer of Salishan Lodge. So the two of them now had this property. Just imagine what McCallum and Gray must have been thinking after the deal closed. They probably asked themselves, what in the hell have we gotten ourselves into? One rumor at the time was that they bought the property not because they wanted to develop it, but because they didn't want Evans to go ahead with his planned development. Next slide. Here's a picture of John Gray and his wife, Betty Gray. And I show this as well because we hear often about the role that Don McCallum and John Gray played in the development of Sunriver. But it was really the four of them who were equally involved in the planning of Sunriver. Next slide. So imagine if you were in their position when they bought these 5,500 acres. Here are some of the obstacles and challenges they must have faced in trying to create Sunriver. Next slide. First, it was 15 miles from Bend, which had about 12,000 people at the time. Oh, before that, go back one, I think. Go forward. The first one was Sunriver was out in the middle of nowhere. Next slide. It was 15 miles from the city of Bend. Next slide. Which had about 12,000 people. Next slide. A cargo train that stopped in Bend for up to 30 minutes, 4 or 5 times per day, but also went along the edge of the resort property. Next slide. Had a 2-lane highway from Bend over Lava Butte, which had no divider and was extremely treacherous in the winter. Next slide. The closest viable airports were in Eugene and Portland. Next slide. It took 2 to 4 hours to drive from Portland, Eugene, and Salem, and that was in good weather. It was 355 miles from Seattle and 426 miles from San Francisco. Next slide. Here is a pamphlet I found when I was doing my research that showed how far it was from every city. And the closest one was Albany, which is 140 miles. Next slide. But on the other hand, while it might look bleak, there were also things that would have been attractive to the developers. The first, next slide, they had a blank canvas to work with. That was ideal in that they didn't have to worry about incremental development. They could make an entire plan for the entire development. Next slide. The 5,500 acres were surrounded on 3 sides by the U.S. National Forest. So most communities grow in bits and spurts, with parcels being annexed as growth dictates. Sunriver had the opportunity to plan the whole community at once, setting aside large parcels of land for a mall, airport, golf courses, etc. Next slide. Another attribute was the beautiful Deschutes River, running 8.5 miles along the other side and through the property. Next slide. There was great hunting, fishing, skiing, and hiking. Next slide. One could really get away from it all, which was one of their objectives. If they wanted to do so, they could develop a community where urban folks, city folks, could really get away from it all in a rural setting. Next slide. They had 270 days of sunshine and low humidity. The 4 of them all lived in Portland, so they knew how much rain impacted their lives, and this must have been appealing to them. Next slide. On average, only 11 days of temperatures over 90 degrees. Fairly easy distance to Mount Bachelor and 11 lakes. So what did they do? Next slide. First, they formed Sunriver Properties in 1964 with Gray as chairman and McCallum as president. The 2 partners, along with their wives, spent considerable time in Bend and in Sunriver, but they were regulars at the Pine Tavern. That was probably the only restaurant in town at the time. The amazing thing to me is they purchased the property in 1964 and then spent 3 full years planning what they wanted to do before the first bit of development was done. Next slide. During this time period, they also brought in Robert Royston, a celebrated Bay Area landscape architect who had worked with Gray on Salishan. Royston spent 1 full year studying the place and was charged with developing what they called the Plan of Sunriver, a comprehensive outline of what the property was going to be developed and managed. So if they purchased property in 1964, guess how long it took to finalize the plan? 3 years. When revealed, the plan was scoffed by many. It contained so many new and radical concepts and ideas that had never been thought of before or even tried. The Bend Bulletin predicted in an editorial that the venture would fail within 2 years. So the plan actually said, the statement was, this Plan of Sunriver was designed to provide a stable and permanent code to govern the manner of development, the protection of land deeded in common, and the organization of government. Next slide. It is interesting to note that Sunriver has adhered to this original plan to this day and is now called the Consolidated Plan of Sunriver. And you can view it on the SROA website. So what exactly was in the plan? I want to share this with you because to this day, this is what makes Sunriver so unique. Next slide. First and foremost, the plan of Sunriver was a preservation of 102 acres of the Great Meadow so that all residents and visitors could enjoy it forever. Next slide. But also the river would remain sacred. Thus, no development was planned or was allowed along the riverbanks of the river. Next slide. No, you got it. Go back. Of course, both areas were prime real estate at the time. According to Royston, the landscape architect, this decision of not building on the Great Meadow and the river cost the corporation $20 million in revenue, and that it would take over 20 years to recover that lost revenue. And the planner said, okay. Folks in the development business ask, what were they thinking? They believe the developer gained nothing by keeping it natural. Next slide. Again, the basic tenet of the plan of Sunriver was that instead of taking over, owners would be guests of the community and would do all they could to coexist with the native animals such as these elk. Next slide. What else was included in the plan of Sunriver? The plan put restrictions on curbs. Initially, Camp Abbott had left roads that were in a grid formation. These were taken out and replaced by having volcanic cinder roads and no set design and no curbs. Next slide. Royston knew the second one was the plan called for 11 roundabouts on main roads to slow down traffic so drivers and passengers alike could look at the beauty around them. Royston knew that drivers in a hurry would curse him, but he calmly replied, why would anyone want to rush through this place as beautiful as this? Next slide. Did you ever consider that a fact driving into Sunriver, if they want to their residence, can do so without ever having to experience a stoplight? Think about it. Next slide. The plan created bike paths for both recreation and easy access to the open place spaces. Next slide. The plan said house colors had to blend in rather than stand out. Now, this idea wasn't in the original plan. Here is a short video which explains how the decision to put in requirements on house colors came about. It features Robert Royston, the key landscape architect on the project, talking about a trip he and John Gray had taken up to the top of Lava Butte, and we're looking at Sunriver. I think you'll get a kick out of it. So show the video, please.
Mountain here called Lava Butte. And one day he and I went up to the top, and one other person.
I don't have any sound.
And we stood on the top and we looked down at this property. You could see everything at that point. And John turned to me and he sort of anger in his voice, and he says, "What's that white thing down there by the stream?" And I said, "John, that's the house you live in." I think 24 hours later, that was a dark brown.
So for those of you wondering how that came about, that was what caused us to have rules on what color paint we can paint our houses. Okay, next slide. What else was included in the plan of Sunriver? The plan called for creating massive common areas of trees and vegetation to retain the natural atmosphere and provide further separation of homes. Next slide. The plan banned outside lighting except those facing down to keep the skylight, a night skylight, unblemished. And I think those of you who enjoy the Sunriver Nature Center can attest to how important that was. Finally, the plan said all utilities were to be buried. That was unheard of back in 1968. The term environmentalism wasn't coined until 1970s. Next slide. The plan even called for the establishment of an environmental committee whose primary responsibility was to ensure that these guidelines were adhered to. Let me remind you that Earth Day would be thought of 2 years later. Next slide. The next brilliant thing that John Gray did was to bring in Jim Anderson, a naturalist, onto the team as the organization's first hire. While it is a general belief that Gray and McCallum were the driving forces behind implementing Sunriver's plan, it was really Royston and Anderson who became the real drivers. According to Anderson, Gray told him in their first meeting that we were going to be visitors here, and your job is to make sure future generations will enjoy the beauty as much as we do. Jim was given great latitude and authority. He was the final arbitrator on any controversy regarding the environment. For example, every tree that was scheduled to be cut down to build a road had to be personally approved by him. Next slide. If it didn't get approved, either the road was moved to avoid cutting down a tree, or in this case, shown here, on West Cascades, they went around the tree so that Jim wanted saved. Jim even resigned in 1974 over a disagreement regarding the restoration effort being done at the river. Next slide. Jim now lives in Bend, and if you ever have an opportunity to meet him, do so. He's quite the character and has hundreds of stories to tell. Next slide. Not everything in the plan of Sunriver got implemented. One concept in the original plan of Sunriver that didn't get implemented was the idea of creating a series of common parking areas at the two entrances to Sunriver, where residents and visitors alike would drive in, park their cars, and use only golf carts, next slide, or vehicles like this one to get around once they arrived. Interesting concept that never gained any traction, partly because the bike craze took over, But even today, one can get from one place to another faster by riding a bike in Sunriver than getting in a car and driving to the place. Another idea that was way ahead of the time was that the plan of Sunriver called for a research and development center. Instead of me explaining how Sunriver was going to become Silicon Valley, let me have John Gray tell you about the idea in a video produced in 1970, another far-sighted idea. So please show the video.
A balanced community where we can provide employment for some people who have to work and who want to live here and work. So we'll attract various levels of people. Therefore, we've planned here an industrial park. You might call it a research and development area. We would hope to attract those kinds of industries that are more research oriented. And with that in mind, we have set aside about 240 gross acres that they can be divided up in 1 acre tracts or 2 acre tracts or 5 acre tracts or 10 acre tracts, whatever the prospective tenant might want. There are types of industries that can do very well here. Executives like to ski, they like to fly, they like the outdoors. Well, this is a great place for them to be. And we think some places in the United States there are 10 or 12 companies that wouldn't mind coming here and being here.
All this conversation, you really didn't.
Interesting concept that John Gray had back then, wasn't it? That making a R&D facility. Okay, by the time, the plan of Sunriver was approved in 1967, and I arrived in 1969, 17 months after the plan they had started implementing the plan. It was so interesting because when I arrived, here's what I found that had been completed already in 17 short months. They had completed the remodeling of the former Camp Abbott Officers Club into what they called the Sunriver Center. Next slide. Building included the sales office, naturally. Next page. A meeting room for owners and also prospective buyers. That's where the presentation was held, I went to. Next one. A gathering place for people to meet. Next slide. This was a miniature models of what Sunriver would look like when it was completed. Next slide. And they even had a place devoted for kids, where the kids could be entertained while you were doing your thing. Next slide. Second major thing, at the lodge that comprised the restaurant, bar, conference room, had been built, and 77 privately owned lodge condos had been built and sold. Those, the lodge is what we have today. Next slide. Pictures of this is the 38,000 square foot lodge. It was completed. Next slide. Total cost to build the 38,000 square foot building was $2,200,000. Couldn't do that today. Next slide. There's another picture of the completed product. Next slide. It was deemed to be one of the most beautiful new structures on the West Coast and received numerous awards. Next page. Here are some pictures, next page. Here are some pictures of what the lodge looked like inside back then. Here's the entrance. Here's a picture of looking down on the dining room. Next one. Here's another picture of that. Next picture. Here's a picture of the dining room itself. Next page. Yep. Next one. Here's the lounge. The resort spent 5.5, it cost $2.2 million to build, and then they spent $5.5 million to renovate the place in 1997, and then spent millions more to upgrade and modernize it again in 2015. Next slide. Another thing I found when I arrived was they had built the first 9 holes of the Meadows golf course. Next slide. Do you know how much, next slide, it cost to build not just the first 9 holes, but the second 9 holes as well? So the 18 holes of the Meadows course cost $525,000. Next slide. Here's a picture of what the end product looked like. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. One more. So that's what the end product looked like when I arrived in 1969. Next slide. Here's what it looks like today. Next slide. Here's a announcement that the course was totally open when I got there. Next slide. They had finished construction of an airport with a 4,500 foot paved airstrip and with night lights. Next slide. I always wondered why having an airport was included in the plan of Sunriver. It didn't make sense from an environmental standpoint. Next slide. It never computed with all of the concerns over the environment. Well, through my research for this class, I discovered that both Don and Mary McCallum were experienced pilots who didn't like having to drive over the mountains to come to Sunriver. Next slide. John Gray didn't complain because he knew that an airport, if an airport was built, it would help attract wealthy investors from California and the Seattle area. He also convinced him that folks who flew in wouldn't be driving cars, which appealed to John Gray. And it turned out to have an airport was a very good decision. Next slide. The western edge of the meadow was a bog during the wet season. It worked out well because the developers needed a place to dump debris from Camp Abbott, which allowed a good foundation for the long runway. And what do you suppose it cost to build the airport? $197,000. Next slide. There was enough room to store planes for folks who were visiting for short periods of time. Next slide. You can see that they didn't have to worry about removing trees in order to build the airport. There were also plenty of room to build hangars for folks with planes. The airstrip was originally 4,500 feet, and it was lengthened to 5,500 feet in 1985, and then widened to 75 feet wide. And then, next slide. Next slide. Then completely repaved in 2008 and 9. New hangars were built in 2014, and new taxiways were built in 2019. Next slide. The other thing that was completed was the South Pool complex. Next slide. Here are pictures of the pool and the diving board. Next. There's another picture of the South Pool. I had a 5-lane Olympic pool and a children's wading pool. Next slide. Total cost to build the South Pool was $250,000. Pool had a 30-year life expectancy, and by 2007, the pool was leaking and couldn't be repaired. We will address what happened with the situation and what was done to fix it in depth in our one of our next upcoming classes. The other thing, next slide. They also built a modest horse corral and tack house. Next slide. There's a picture of the corral. Next slide. And the horses. Next slide. They also built 8 miles of bike paths and 4 underpasses. Next page. An interesting piece of trivia is that both our current fire and police chiefs worked as teenagers helping to build our roads and bike paths. Next slide. Our fire chief, Tim Moore, spent his summers for years working for Babbler Brothers, his grandfather's construction company here in Sunriver. He worked on building the roads, sewer system, golf courses, whatever. Next slide. Tim admits that working construction in Sunriver convinced him that he didn't want to join the family business and that he wanted to become a fireman instead. We're lucky that he made this decision. They also, next slide. They also built a small marina along the Deschutes River. Next slide. Here it is, picture of the marina. Next slide. You could even get gas at this marina. The boat in the background was a paddle boat that took people up and down the river. Next slide. They built 26 cluster cabins, all in 17 months. Next slide. Here's a picture of the cluster cabin. Next slide. Here's a picture of the cluster cabin. Next slide. They built a 20-unit Powder Village apartment complex. Next picture. There's a picture of it. And the final thing they said they had done was, these were all accomplished by the time I visited. What I didn't see was the 11th major accomplishment. The owners announced when I was there that they planned to build an amphitheater to seat 2,500 to 5,000 people. Interestingly enough, they planned to build it along Beaver Drive, where current Shark is currently located. You don't believe me? Next slide. Here is the brochure that I had. I circled the start of the major outdoor amphitheater. So to me, it was amazing how much they had accomplished. So what I'm going to do now, I think, is stop right here, and we'll continue on the next program in 2 weeks, if that's okay with you, Nathan.
Nope, that is perfect. And I'm just kind of blown away with the number of photos and the artifacts that you've kind of collected. That's pretty amazing. I feel like I've learned so much tonight. It's ridiculous. Now, granted, I'm a recent transfer, but but it's pretty amazing stuff. Let me go through here real quick. We definitely have some questions that have been submitted for us, John. We'll go ahead and throw the Mentimeter slide up real quick, just explain to everybody how to do this. You can submit questions to us via YouTube, or you can submit questions through menti.com, and you're going to input that event code that we've provided for you. You are able to submit one question at a time, just again, so John doesn't get bombarded with a ton of questions. And we're going to go ahead and answer questions through 7:30. I'm hoping, if anything else, this has kind of started your appetite for all this information that he's going to keep going into for the next 2 sessions. So we won't be able to get to every question, but please, if you email us at events@osucascades.edu, we'll make sure John gets that information to maybe answer those questions. So going, I guess, first with our first question, John, looks like we've got somebody, John Stoors, S-T-O-O-R-S. Oh, I'm losing my screen, everybody. Sorry about that. Looks like I have a little lighting issue. We'll work with it. Stoors is known as one of the greatest architects in the Northwest and is credited with the development of the Northwest style vernacular architecture. Is there anything that came up, I guess, in your research kind of around his contributions at that time period?
Not that I know of, but what they did do is once they got the plan of Sunriver done, they hired a whole series of very well-known architects to build the lodge condos, the cluster cabins, the pole houses, the metal lodges. So they all received the copy of the plan of Sunriver and then were required to submit their architectural drawings of what they would have, what they would do for their condos that they were going to develop. So So as you drive around Sunriver, you'll notice that all of these different subdivisions of Sunriver are very well done, very beautiful, and they were all done by different architects. So I'm sure Storrs is one of those that was chosen.
Okay, excellent. And then looks like somebody's saying there used to be a mural that used to be outside the country grocery store before the village was remodeled. And it said that we had some of the circles because of the Camp Abbott large vehicles. Is that anything in your research that came up with that?
That is fascinating. No, I've not. That's the first time I've heard that now. That is interesting. Just from a side, the new circle that we have at the front of the village mall was designed and had to take into account the fire trucks to make sure that fire trucks and the large trucks that need to come in to service Sunriver and the mall could get around the circles. So I know that part, but I hadn't heard anything about the Camp Abbott portion of that. That's interesting.
Good. Oh, and like I anticipated, the questions are coming in now.
And let me interrupt for a minute.
Yeah.
Much of what I've gathered by way of information has been from people like that who have come to me and said, "Did you know this?" And I didn't know it, and I can incorporate it into the program. So for those people out there viewing it, if you have some of that tidbits that I haven't included, make sure you get a hold of me and let me know so I can incorporate it in my programs.
Oh, that's great. No, that's a really good idea. That's a really good idea. Another question coming out: are there any original houses from 1968?
Oh, plenty of them. Yes. In fact, the videos we saw today came from a marketing video that I have that somehow I want to try to incorporate, but it actually shows some of those original houses that are still there. The house that was referred to by in the video with Bob Royston that John Gray actually bought is still there. It's on the 15 fairway of the Meadows course and is owned by Kate Mendenhall, who is a longtime Sunriver resident.
That's awesome. Another question coming in. So regarding kind of vision of the community, what was the vision from the start as to the percentage of owners versus visitors, and had they held true to that?
I'll talk a little bit more in one of my future classes, but interestingly enough, John Gray believed that they started in 1969 or whenever, to say 1970, they believed that by 1985, we would have 15,000 permanent residents. And that has we've never come close to that. And that's a good thing. It's a piece of information that I've always found interesting. And it's something that people ought to debate. Why is that? Why haven't we become more than a recreational vacation home community, and yet we do have a vibrant, sizable permanent residents, but nowhere near the 15,000.
Looks like a comment that came in too. So just they're letting you know this has been a very fun history lesson. So again, thank you for your time with this. My parents moved to Sunriver in 1972, and my dad was the second artist in residence hired by John Gray. He ran the pottery studio and still lives in Sunriver 50 years later. So neat little resident fun fact from that too. So thanks for submitting that.
Piece of tidbit on that is I had, don't have it now. I don't know where it went, but I had a piece of that pottery, a light fixture done by that potter that I bought in, I think, 1972 or 1973.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And these are coming in. So I think that's the thing is, I think that's the rich history of this area that I think either people take for granted or just didn't know. I mean, we've got all kinds of viewers that are submitting things about kind of like personal stories. Another one that came up, there's still some of the old red cinder golf cart paths too. And you can still find bullets and logs out there by the river. And they're anticipating from Army practice days for firing range shooting or whatever that might be. So a little local piece out there. Let's see here. Looks like, was it the 20 units called the Abbott houses? was that employee housing? And they're referencing just to the north where some of the old barracks were. Was that what that was?
I believe it was. Yeah, I think
Okay.
that's what that initial plan was.
Okay, excellent. And it looks like, so some other questions. We've got, you had mentioned like when the logging, like the earlier logging in Sunriver, was replanting much of a priority for logging companies at that time when Sunriver was harvested?
I don't understand, and I've never been able to talk to anybody why they didn't think about that. My opinion is that until the government got involved in requiring the lumber companies to replenish their trees, lumber companies just said there are enough trees out there. I won't worry about it. I'll just keep cutting and let nature take its course. But as you can see in some of the pictures, Sunriver, when I first came visiting here, had very few trees. The reason we have so many lodge poles now is because they come back faster and they grow faster, and so they kind of took over. And there weren't the ponderosas there in the first place, so they're the ones. And now we have a big effort on trying to plant ponderosas so that the future generations will enjoy them. And the lodge poles, as I understand it, have a life cycle of about 45 to 50 years, and that's why so many of them are dying and falling down right now. Is that they've run their course, and so we're doing an effort to plant more and more ponderosas.
Well, I think again, as somebody relatively new to the Pacific Northwest, I was actually floored when you showed me some of those maps earlier, and specifically around the Venice idea, that map concept. But some of the pictures you showed where it was just barren. I mean, I had not realized that everything was cleared to such a degree. So that's profoundly interesting. Really, really, really interesting stuff. Let's see. One of the questions is, actually, who planted our current ponderosas? So was there maybe a specific effort with that, or has that had just been done kind of at a smaller community level?
Well, it's actually, there's an individual here in Sunriver who was a retired teacher who took it upon himself to do something about it. And he, for probably 10 years now, 15 years, has really spearheaded the whole effort, has gotten the schools involved in helping to replant and so forth. And then also the Nature Center every year has a sale of seedlings, and people can come in and pick up seedlings and plant them themselves. So that's one of the environmental efforts that we have going on in the community.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, it looks like two other fun facts. When someone bought a lot, they got a kerosene lamp made by Steve Williams with the Sunriver logo.
Steve Williams is the pottery person who's still in the area, and who I end up getting my lamp from.
Well, it also sounds like another person chimed in that the wagon wheel chandeliers that adorn the Great Hall were they first from Steve as well?
I don't know. Steve actually had a pottery shop in the mall, and you could actually go in and commission him to make something for you while you were staying in Sunriver, visiting and stuff. He'd go in and look at something. I'd like something like that, and he would build it for you while you were there.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, I mean, have access to somebody like that, or have the skill to do that. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing. Well, great. Let's see, another question. Oh, what has been the most interesting artifact that you have uncovered in history hunting for these presentations?
I actually think, for me anyway, it was somebody came and delivered me this sweater that I have behind me. And it's actually, you can see the Sunriver logo. It was actually worn by the gentleman who greeted you when you came into the front entrance to the lodge.
Mm-hmm.
I visit, and I've kind of threatened to wear it and walk into the lodge and to Tom O'Shea, who's the current general manager, and present it to him maybe, but I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it. But to me, it's a nice artifact.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. I like that. I might wear that. It probably won't fit me though, unless you got that thing in a XXL. Let's see. Oh, this is a really good one too, because we mentioned it earlier. I didn't know, well, this is what the question is asking. I didn't know about the Venice of Oregon development concept. Is there any idea how the general public thought about that before ownership was transferred?
Tell me again what the question was.
Around the kind of the Venice of Oregon, like doing the waterways and the waterfront property, what was general public opinion like? Were people supportive of that development, or did they also kind of share the same, I don't want that sort of development in Sunriver?
I think, especially back then, that people were attracted to that idea. That people, the original people who first came here were kind of adventurous anyhow, and risk takers. And I think they like that concept. And the part of the reason I'm putting on the program is I want people today to recognize the far thinking aspects of the plan and what they did, and we're the beneficiaries, and how do we keep it going. One example of that is I came across this and I didn't realize it. Look at where the mall is located and where the North Store are located. They're located on the edge of Sunriver. The original design had them in the middle of Sunriver. And so we would have had all these trucks coming in, driving through our community in order to get to the mall or to the shopping areas. They don't do that now. And to me, that just thinking of that and having a plan that thought about all these things ahead of time, we're the beneficiaries of, and we just take it for granted. We don't think about how neat that is, that we don't have that happen. I don't have people driving, trucks through my neighborhood and stuff. And I want people to appreciate that and to relish it and say, and say, we need it. What can we do? An example of that for those folks is, the board this last month just ruled against having electric bikes on the bike paths. They said it didn't fit in with what the vision of Sunriver was and what we're all about. You can have the bikes where you can pedal uphill and the electricity will take over, but you can't have an electric bike. Well, if you don't appreciate what we have and what we're trying to accomplish, somebody might come along and say, well, why don't we allow electric bikes and motorcycles or whatever on the bike paths? So I think it's important to have a good understanding of where we've been and why we are where we are today, and appreciate that. So people who come here, the first thing you want to do is build a fence. Fences aren't allowed because you want to be open and in tune with nature. So we have houses far apart rather than being right next to each other, but we don't allow fences. Those kind of things. I think it's important to understand why is it that we can't do these things and to appreciate it.
Yep. Well, and I think again, that's the value that this little class series is going to bring, is kind of some of that deeper appreciation to what we have is, again, one of the greatest places, in my opinion, in Central Oregon. So John, I want to thank you at the time. There are still questions coming in. Clearly we can't get to everything tonight in one show, but folks, definitely chime in with those questions during the next presentation. John, you have something real quick?
Can Dan bring up my last slide I have?
Yeah. We sure can, guys. If we can transition, just give a second to get that up real quick.
90 on my list.
And John, are we looking for that quiz slide or the last slide?
Here's what wasn't included in today's program.
And maybe the very last slide, I think, in the deck, guys.
And all I want to do is try to encourage people to come to the next program, because
well, why don't we do this? There we go. Well, here's not what included. There we go. Perfect.
So this is just some of the things I haven't included in here, but in addition, I wanted to include the fact that we of Connecticut Mutual life insurance, their role in the fact that they came in and were part owners of the program and so forth, and why we don't have Circle 8 and those kind of things. So there's tons of stuff still to be talked about. So I just want to encourage people to sign up for the second and third programs, because I think you'll find them very interesting. And two that I don't show necessarily on here that are very important are shark. How did the shark come about?
Yep.
And the mall itself. And just for a tickler, I want to know if how many of you out in there watching this know that 2 of the former owners of Sunriver are in jail for pyramid schemes. So that's just kind of the tickler to get you to come back.
I love it. I love it. Well, we'll have John. We'll have you hang tight in the production studios. We kind of wrap up. So I'll have you hang around. We'll kind of send everybody off. But I just want to say again, everybody, thanks for participating. Huge shout out tonight for OSU Cascades and Connect Central Oregon for the assistance and production of this series. This has been a lot of fun for me personally. But I think that this is something that it's a neat example of the ways in which we can provide really interesting community content. We're going to see you guys all back here for classes 2 and 3 at the Sunriver U YouTube channel. That was confusing me a little bit saying Sunriver U YouTube, but you all get me. We're going to be back on the channel again in 2 Thursday nights, and then the 2 weeks following that as well. March 25th is going to be the next presentation at 6 p.m. So make sure you sign up. And then also don't forget, everybody, because we're doing these via YouTube, the benefit is you can come back and watch this later. You can send it to a friend. So this now exists as an event at the Sunriver U YouTube channel. So it's something very easy to share with friends. Maybe you've got family that might be interested in the history, kind of know a little bit about where you live. So it could be a really interesting tool. Realtors out there, use it as showing guests what we kind of have to offer in Sunriver. So I think there's a lot of ways that hopefully we can use this series. But again, thank you guys all tonight. Thanks for joining. Huge shout out to John, of course. The time, the effort, not only tonight, but putting this whole thing together, pretty amazing. And great to have such a dedicated community member here in Central Oregon supporting Sunriver. So again, everybody, thank you so much, and we will see you next time.